Welcome to this roundtable discussion on the Teaching Archive. I'm Alice Kaplan. I'm the director of the Whitney Humanities Center, and I will be moderating today. Allow me to briefly introduce our authors and participants. First, Rachel Sagner Buurma teaches English literature at Swarthmore College, where she co-directs the Eliot Foundation, a center supporting interdisciplinary liberal arts education. Her work focuses on 18th and 19th century literature and print culture, the history of the novel, 20th century Anglo-American literary criticism, and the history of higher education. She's working on a book on the social, literary, critical origins of narrative omniscience, and she has another book project on how Victorian novelists did their research. Laura Heffernan teaches English literature at the University of North Florida, and her focus is 19th and 20th century literature and culture, histories of reading, and histories of literary criticism. She teaches courses on the history of the novel, modernist literature, digital methods in literary study, and later periods of British literature. She's currently serving as director of UNF's Digital Humanities Institute. Together, they have published the Teaching Archive, a groundbreaking approach to literary history that takes us inside the classrooms of major literary critics through their class notes and archives. And what better time than now, after this year of exile from our own classrooms, to acknowledge the classroom experience as a prime incubator of critical thought. Eye-opening, paradigm-shifting, restorative, humbling, all these words came to mind as I was reading the Teaching Archive. Note that we are putting a link to the book with the University of Chicago Press discount on the chat feature. Rachel Sagner Buurma and Laura Heffernan will be joined today by Caleb Smith, professor of English and American Studies at Yale University, who also teaches American literature at McDougall Walker Correctional Institution through the Yale Prison Education Initiative. Caleb Smith's work explores the contradictions in American history between liberty and enslavement, democracy and domination, secularism and fanaticism. And you can read a chapter from his forthcoming book, Disciplines of Attention in a Secular Age in Critical Inquiry. Now I'd like to turn the floor to Rachel and Laura, who will give an overview of the Teaching Archive. Caleb Smith will respond, and then we will open the floor to questions. So please post your questions at any time during the presentations in the Q&A, and don't hesitate to use the chat for your expressions of interest and enthusiasm and for relevant bibliography. Rachel and Laura.
Alice, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Can you see me okay? Great. And thanks to Diane and Sarah and the rest of the Whitney Humanities staff also. Thanks also to Caleb for joining us today. We're really looking forward to our conversation with you. So the Teaching Archive recovers the everyday teaching of literary scholars over the course of the 20th century in order to write a new history for the discipline of English studies. And this book really began with our dissatisfaction with existing approaches to disciplinary history so far, and with the ways in which disciplinary practice gets represented in contemporary battles over reading methods. Existing disciplinary histories tend to take a selective and we think kind of distant view of our profession. We're thinking here of Gerald Graff's Professing Literature or John Guillory's Cultural Capital. To the extent that these disciplinary histories perform research on our discipline's history, their research tends to survey the discipline's most self-conscious moments rather than its kind of practical everyday ones. Traditional disciplinary history of English studies tends to turn to methodological manifestos and professional addresses, mission statements, and public feuds. And it tends to produce a sense of our past that emphasizes innovation and originality and rupture, rather than the everyday continuities that we think are more familiar to everyday practice. So for us, and we think for many others, this produces a kind of alienating and not so useful account of our profession. method wars are not a good representation of the everyday practices of the discipline and the day-to-day work of it, the longer continuities that extend across our training and knit us together. Disciplinary histories also, we noticed, tended to ignore a really major part of our professional lives, our classroom teaching. There's been a tendency, just a sort of default tendency, to assume that English professors practice some form of close reading in the classroom, no matter what they were actually doing in their research. And there's recurring reference to just a small set of pedagogical theoretical texts like Practical Criticism or The Well-Wrought Urn, and textbooks like Understanding Poetry, Brooks and Warren, tend to stand in for the real history of teaching. So we decided what we wanted to do was take a closer look at what and how professors have taught by seeking out their teaching papers. And so what we did do that was come here to Yale first, to the Beinecke, to look at Cleonce Brooks's teaching papers. We were curious to know whether and how Brooks's classroom teaching matched his account in The Well-Wrought Urn of how and why an English professor should cultivate students' appreciation for aesthetic form. And the really unique thing that we never found again, that we found in Brooks's papers, was a transcription of his modern poetry class from the early 1960s. He had contracted with, I think, Random House to write a book based on those lectures. And so it employed a stenographer to transcribe every single thing, the back and forth between himself and the students, even like the initial chat at the beginning of the class period. And we never got to see that again. After working on Brooks, though, we decided that we wanted to move outwards and look at other kinds of institutions. We were really curious to know what teaching looked like at institutions, at the kinds of institutions in which most people who go to college, right, i.e. not Yale, even though most disciplinary histories tend to center on elite institutions like Yale. And Laura's going to tell you a little bit about the kinds of places, the kinds of different kinds of institutions where we went to look at classrooms.
Yes, so thanks, Rachel. So after we looked at Brooks's papers at Yale, we went to go look at J. Saunders Redding's archive, his teaching papers from Hampton University. We looked at Caroline Spurgeon's teaching papers at Bedford Women's College from the early 20th century. We looked at T.S. Eliot's papers from the Workers' Educational Association tutorial he taught, which we'll talk about in a minute. We looked at I.A. Richards's teaching papers at Cambridge and Edith Rickart's teaching papers at the University of Chicago. We also looked at Simon J. Ortiz and what he had taught at Marin College in Northern California and the University of New Mexico and Dean A. College. And we looked at Josephine Miles, her teaching at Berkeley. We looked at Josephina Niggli teaching drama at Western Carolina College in the 1950s. We actually looked at many more archives than we ended up including in the book. And as we'll describe today, each of the places that we went sort of required us to develop a new approach to our research. And each place really taught us something different. So we'll start talking today. The first example we will take you through is T.S. Eliot's Modern English Literature tutorial, which he taught here at Southall Grammar School, just outside of London, from 1916 through 1919, so during World War I. Eliot taught a couple of extension courses in these years, but this course was a course taught through the University of London, but in partnership with the Workers' Educational Association. And so it was a 3-year tutorial course. And one of the things we had to do was go look at a bunch of different WEA tutorial syllabi to kind of understand the institutional values of these particular extension courses. So WEA syllabi reflected the fact that these tutorials were meant to be an exercise in kind of deep equality. Teachers were fellow students, students were fellow teachers, and they agreed to study together for 3 years. It was essentially a community building exercise. So communities decided what courses they wanted to take. And then once they had embarked on a course with a tutor of their choosing, they would work together to revise the course list in years 2 and 3 of the syllabus. By and large, these students kind of rejected the university's schemes to kind of elevate the best among them to a place in the university. For them, the point was really to extend study outside of the seminar itself. So WEA students often retaught their classes to other community members. They had held study groups, including family members. And the idea was that study would create more study rather than individual achievement or accreditation. And so when we looked at Eliot's syllabi, it was really clear to us that he learned how to adjust his pedagogy to the WEA. He made significant changes between his first and his second year, and then his second and his third year. He responded to what the students wanted to learn, and he slowed down. This is probably familiar to those of you who here are teachers. He became much less ambitious in what he thought he could cover in the second and third years. And most notably, he moved from a syllabus that was organized around the individual author to a syllabus that was deeply interconnected and that brought back to life the material working world of Elizabethan writers. So this had a practical purpose for him. It helps students engage in individual study to follow up their particular interests and to write seminar papers that would then continue to be useful and to connect back up with class discussion in later weeks. But it also sort of allowed the class to reimagine these writers as working writers. You can see in the Elizabethan literature syllabus I have up here, he's teaching not an author-based syllabus, but he's teaching popular festival and religious rite in week 1, Renaissance humanism, the Elizabethan stage. Students are learning a lot about the context in which these writers were working.
And once you see how Eliot adapted his teaching to the values of the WEA, to the Workers' Education Association, you can also see really dramatically how his classroom teaching shaped his public writing. So while Eliot was teaching his Elizabethan literature seminar, he was also writing his famous book of essays, The Sacred Wood, which, if you don't know it, is a book really often credited with changing literary taste in the Anglophone world of letters into something more spare and formal and elite, saying goodbye to Tennyson and hello to Dryden and Donne. The Sacred Wood includes essays on figures like Marlowe and Massinger and Johnson, whose plays Eliot had read with his students in his seminar. But the connections are even much deeper than that, because what you really see in the idea of literary tradition that Eliot famously talks about in The Sacred Wood is how the WEA impacted Eliot's sense of that tradition and of literary value. You really see in The Sacred Wood a sense of writing as important, not for its singularity and originality, but for the extent to which it makes further writing possible. So while most readings of The Sacred Wood focus on literary tradition as elite, and Eliot's view of literary tradition as elite and specialist, once you see Eliot's classroom, you really realize that that view of literary tradition is much more about workaday writing and the possibilities of collective writing. And then this was an insight that we began to see everywhere we looked after we realized this about Eliot's classroom sort of being inside, encoded inside The Sacred Wood. We realized that classrooms live inside and have strongly shaped many, many of the major works of criticism that we read and teach. So we realized, for example, that Edmund Wilson's historical interpretation of literature essay grew out of his Varieties of 19th Century Criticism course that he taught at Chicago in 1939. We came to see that Carolyn Spurgeon's still cited work, Shakespeare's Imagery and What It Tells Us, that she published in the 1930s, grew out of the Art of Reading course that she taught at Bedford College for Women in the 19-teens. And we saw how Simon Ortiz had worked out the ideas for his important essay Towards a National Indian Literature while he was revising his Native American Lit course between 1976 and 1979 for his students at Marin College. So we're going to give another example of how this happens.
So the second example, this is the course book list for Josephine Miles's English 1A course. Miles was a poet and a professor. She was the first woman tenured in the English department at Berkeley. And she taught a bunch of different courses in the department. She taught a very popular verse composition course. She taught upper level seminars and graduate seminars on the lyric. and on 17th century poetry and research methods. But she most commonly taught English 1A, which was essentially the first year writing course at Berkeley. And she taught it for over 3 decades. You can see here, you maybe can't quite see, but the book list that she's jotted down for her students includes a style guide, a dictionary, also Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, a modern classic of their choosing, so they can choose Mann or Proust or Joyce or Shaw or O'Neill, a modern bestseller, she says, see scrap lists, Story Magazine, Poetry Magazine, Harper's, the Southern Review, the New Yorker, the New Republic, and a specialty magazine. Miles is, every archive we went to, people keep their teaching notes very differently. Miles kept tons of teaching notes on these tiny pieces of notebook paper in tiny script. And she did keep notes for every semester of English 1A that she taught. And the notes really testify to the fact that it was a very workshop style course. She said, in fact, to the students at the beginning of the fall 1940 course, she described it as a lab or machine tool course where the prof doesn't tell and just watches practice. And she would often begin this course with what she called the corner essay. She would send students out to a street corner, usually the corner of Oxford and University in Berkeley, and she'd ask them to stand there for an hour and then write an essay about it. And quite often the students would give her a first draft back that was simply a chronological report of everything they'd seen while they were standing on the street corner. And she would work with them to revise the essays so that the essays would have perspective, so that they would order a little bit more the sense data that they had acquired, give a little bit more of a narrative or a story, give meaning to what they'd seen. And that kind of work of taking perspective was something that Miles thought about as beginning at the level of the sentence. So the writer of a sentence orders the elements in the sentence through syntax, through subordinating clauses, connecting, and prepositions. And so Miles had students work on sentences over and over in English 1A. She had them write 50-word sentences together. She had them choose a sentence from a reading and analyze its function and its transition. She had them write a sentence on that encapsulated a belief that they held. And they worked every single day, essentially, on sentences.
And this interest in language at the level of the sentence went alongside the quantitative work Miles was doing from the 1940s forward. She was working with a big corpus of English poetry to count the vocabulary of each era, trying to characterize the vocabulary that poets had to work with as sort of to hand in each era as phrasal or clausal, as focused either on adjectives, basically, or on nouns. If we could have table A from continuity, you can see some of her results there up to the left. So we realized while doing this work also that Miles is one of the foundational figures in distant reading and digital humanities. In addition to the hand-counted data, the dozens of monographs she published, which she helped her graduate students helped her with quite a lot. In the 1940s, she also created a computerized concordance to the complete works of John Dryden. She inherited this concordance to Dryden project from a senior colleague and ended up collaborating with her graduate students and with the women in the electrical engineering department at Berkeley that ran the IBM machines. Roberto Busa, Father Busa, is really still to this day thought of as the father of digital humanities and a computationally assisted literary study. But Miles made her concordance of Dryden far before he made his. And really, she is really, we think, one of the founders of distant reading in a way that Busa isn't. And that's a kind of dramatic example of how looking at teaching archives can totally change the way we think about the history of our discipline. But in general, looking at teaching archives gives us a really new view of a few different things, which we're just going to chat about very briefly before we turn to our conversation with Caleb and with the rest of you. Across all the archives and the classrooms we looked at, we see a really different history of method. Broadly, we see not a kind of contrapuntal set of arguments played out in publications, but we see especially a longer and more nuanced kind of historicism, is just an example. But we also find a really different view of who has made our discipline, because once you realize that teachers of literature have made our discipline, you have a lot more possibilities for thinking about its fashioning and its shaping. Looking at these teaching archives also has given us a really different view of what has been taught in the classroom. So yes, canonical texts in all of these archives, but also a long, long tail of less canonical texts and in fact, totally unliterary texts. Maybe as much as half of what's taught in classrooms, we think, is not canonical at all. So you still get Shakespeare, you still get Mrs. Dalloway, but you also have all these other things. And then the last thing we wanted to touch on, the other thing that we saw throughout these archives is how closely teaching and research and publication are intertwined in a way that we think they still are for most practitioners today, despite the fact that the modern research university has really done its very best to pull them apart. So the very idea that we can have teaching faculty or adjuncts, like people who are academic workers who are not imagined as doing research at all as part of their job, is a huge part of this, obviously, as are tenure processes and all kinds of other mechanisms. But we think it's a real testament to the strength of the actual long history of teaching and research being intertwined, that so many of us continue to experience them as connected, despite all these administrative mechanisms that make us pull them apart. Laura, is there anything else you want to say briefly?
I think that's it for now. Yeah.
Okay. So Caleb and Alice, I think you're going to, we're sorry, we're going to turn over to Caleb, who's going to speak a little, and then we're going to talk with Caleb.
Thanks, Rachel and Laura, for that presentation and for your fantastic book. Thank you to Alice and the Whitney Humanities Center organizers and staff for inviting me to be a part of this event. I have the highest respect for the rigor and intelligence and thoughtfulness of this book, The Teaching Archive, and I'm so excited to be here to have a chance to talk about it with you. I just wanted to say a little bit about the shape of the book and what it means to me. I'll say a little bit about my own teaching. I'll mention one of our own, some teaching archives that we have here at Yale. And then I'll ask a few questions about what I take to be some of the kind of implications of the book or the bigger arguments that you've offered to us. So this book brings two teachers of English, teachers of literature, students of English literature, some very basic questions and very serious questions. What is this discipline of literary studies? What are its origins? How has it changed over the past half century or century? Who participates in it? Who shapes its practices, its self-understanding? What are its characteristic theories, methods, arguments, materials? As Laura and Rachel have mentioned, a number of histories of the discipline have been written, and many of them tend to follow more or less by now familiar kind of arc. They are histories of prevailing ideas, or in other words, histories of what English professors have said about what they're doing in their work. And by their work, they normally mean their published scholarship. I think it's probably true that if you ask a number of English professors about their work, they'll take you to be asking about their writing or about their scholarship. Whereas if you ask them about their job, they might take you to be asking about their teaching and their service. So those histories of the discipline perhaps tend to focus on influential books and articles in which literary critics explicitly reflect on their own practices and the kind of debates of their time. And this produces an account of the history of the discipline that's sort of organized around some strong disagreements between camps: philologists versus aesthetes, historicists versus formalists, multiculturalists versus the defenders of a canon. Those are some of the familiar kind of patterns that emerge. And then there's a kind of story about a big change that happens sometime around or after 1968, when the discipline moves from the era of the old new critics to a more diversified and interdisciplinary enterprise that's drawing from traditions in critical theory, cultural studies, area studies, ethnic studies, and other fields. And here's where Laura and Rachel in the teaching archive make their big intervention. They ask us to look not at what literary critics have said or explicitly, how they've explicitly described their project, but instead look at the materials that they have produced as teachers. The true history of English literary study resides in classrooms, they write, in one of their most polemical moments, maybe in the introduction, and maybe even more polemically, disciplinary historians of English have, by and large, declined to research in their field. In other words, we won't really know the history of our discipline until we've studied the history of its teaching in the classrooms. So the classroom as a space of experimentation, as a space of research and creative work, not only the transmission of knowledge from the teacher to the student. And here they argue against the kind of separation of teaching and research in how the discipline understands its own history, and in how our work as well is measured and assessed, whether by each other or by the universities or perhaps by the public. I wanted to touch on three kind of consequences of this methodological reorientation of the history of our discipline. One, what they show us is that in practice, literary studies draws from many methods, mixing formal analysis with historical contextualization, mixing close reading with ideology critique, mixing thematic questions and complicated sort of computational techniques, somewhat promiscuously. And as Rachel and Laura mentioned in their introductory remarks, we would probably find this to be true if we were just reading through the kind of practical criticism of any particular period. And we certainly find it in the classrooms, but we find it less in kind of method wars situations where people feel compelled to align themselves with one method or with one argument or with one concept against some opponent in a debate. And so, Laura and Rachel are kind of teaching us how not to separate those the kind of eclecticism of the discipline out into those mutually antagonistic camps. Second, there's a kind of historiographic argument about when and how the era of close reading or the era of the new critics gave way to some time of pluralism in the methods and objects of literary study. And there, what the teaching archive is showing us is that it's not really right to say that there's a kind of post-1968 diversification, particularly not a kind of set of arguments within elite institutions that then radiates out and transforms the curricula at other institutions across the country or around the world, but instead that there were many different kinds of practices going on at many different kinds of institutions all along, that kind of eclecticism and diversity of theories and methods is there if you go and look for it in different kinds of classrooms. Finally, and maybe most controversially, there's a set of kind of ethical and political arguments about what happens when we value teaching. When we value what happens in the classroom and how that might help us to defend our discipline in a time of crisis, how it might help us to see a kind of common cause across methodological differences, and the sort of difference that this new history might make in this time of crisis in our discipline, where the question some people might be asking is less what is literary studies and more what was literary studies. I found this book to be an illumination and to resonate with my own experience in teaching both in Yale University classrooms and in prison classrooms, two kinds of institutions that are sort of at the margins of the big central picture that Laura and Rachel are drawing for us in the teaching archive. And in those classrooms, I've found, especially in teaching across the two of them, I've found how teaching with different groups of students, even with the same, more or less the same syllabus, has really caused me to reorient my sense of what counts as remedial in one situation and what feels advanced in another situation, or what feels radical in one situation versus feeling conservative or even reactionary in another situation. And so it does seem right to say that the practical experience of teaching and working with students in our discipline really kind of reorients and destabilizes some of the conventional and rigid oppositions that we make when we argue perhaps badly about what it is that we're doing. I wanted to show a couple of images. These are from not from my own teaching archive, but they are archival images held here at Yale in the Beinecke. This is James Weldon Johnson in his classroom at Fisk University around 1933. I show it partly because we're all nostalgic and miss being in classrooms with each other, miss working with each other, but also because as soon as you see this image, you see how it raises such complicated questions about elitism and anti-elitism, about hierarchy and equality, about democratization and integration in the context of Fisk University in the 1930s. My second image is from Johnson's own teaching notes, and this is a list of paper titles of papers that his students wrote for the course. I brought it to you partly because of the little cross out that you'll see there on number 6, which says comparison of something value of Douglas's 4 different autobiographies. This is a student's paper title. And what comes before value is originally written in as literary, and then it's crossed out, and the word historical has been inserted there. So that kind of interplay of the literary and the historical seems so kind of central to Rachel and Laura's arguments in the book, and also raised for me what would be an interesting question about how the archival scholar would deal with a kind of with an instance like this, where the archive presents us with some ambiguity that we have to resolve, or some revision that we would need to make some decisions about what its meaning was. But the other reason that I wanted to share this picture was just to give you the sense of Johnson's sense that an important thing that his students were working toward in that classroom was the writing of these papers. In fact, Johnson typed up this list of papers and included it the next time he taught this course as in part of the course description to say this is the kind of work that students would be doing in his course. So I wanted to close with a couple of questions. And these questions come out of my own experience as a teacher, come out of my own experience as a researcher in histories of discipline, and are partly prompted by some of what we've just seen in the archival things we've looked at together. First, I guess a question about discipline itself and how we value it. One way to describe the project of the teaching archive, I think, and Laura and Rachel can maybe respond to this characterization, is that they have reoriented our history of the discipline of English, or the discipline of literary studies, by bringing it within the historiography of education. In other words, they're writing a history of teaching, they're writing a history of classrooms. That is its own discipline, education, and the history of education. And it has its own interesting kind of transformations in the post-1968 period. Specifically, a kind of critique of a traditional liberal account of the value or the meaning of education, public and otherwise. There was, in the post-1968 period, a really kind of radical critique of educational institutions. We can associate this with Foucault's work on knowledge and power, but also major critiques by post-colonial and indigenous scholars who were thinking about the alliance between educational institutions and politics and a kind of forms of power that they very much saw themselves in opposition to. And so I wonder what that kind of account of what a classroom is might do with, and in conversation with, the kind of story that Rachel and Laura are telling us in the teaching archive, which is so much a book about reminding us or teaching us again how to value what happens in classrooms, how to value education and its institutions across different kind of social stratifications. Along with that, I wanted to raise a question about the teaching of writing, and the Josephine Miles example of English 1A really helps us to get there. I think that's a place where the book is really thinking about the composition classroom. Because one question I did have in reading the text had to do with whether the emphasis on literary studies and reading, how that fits in relation to the kind of stratification or division between the teaching of literature and the teaching of writing. both of which might be thought of as very integral to the history of English as a discipline, but which are increasingly kind of separated out from each other and in hierarchized ways within universities today. In my own research and my own writing, I've sometimes made an argument that we need to learn to see close reading itself as a form of writing. And I realized that a kind of critique of that implicit in the teaching archive might be to say that I am doing the thing that Laura and Rachel accuse disciplinary historians and theorists of doing when they say that we overemphasize our published writing and underemphasize what happens in the classroom. But it has often felt to me that thinking about literary criticism, about what's called reading as a practice of writing, can have the other effect as well. That is, it links up with the teaching of composition, it links up with the teaching of writing, and makes those things part of a continuous practice rather than insisting on a division between them. So I'd really be interested to hear, and maybe I could just bring Laura and Rachel and Alice all back on now, and I present those to you as open questions and the starting points for our conversation.
Thank you, Caleb. And I'm encouraging people to enter their intervention in the Q&A, but meanwhile, pass the floor to our authors for some responses, and I'll have some responses due to that great intervention by Caleb.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. I mean, we could spend the last 20 minutes just on one of these questions, so maybe we'll try to touch really briefly on them, make sure we have time for others. But yes, I mean, I think we also see that Foucauldian turn in literary studies too. We have the same debate about the history of the novel, right? And how we're gonna, I think the thing I'd emphasize about our work is that we are trying to value, but not glamorize or paint portraits of like great teachers, but really just trying to think, not just, but really trying to think more about what practice looked like. And I think that those Foucauldian critiques of education have still been real, and the disciplinary historical works that do engage them have been really important to us. I mean, the same thing that people point out about Foucault and its uses is true for the sort of the historiography of education turn, which is that Foucault is not saying you can undo those aspects of institutions, right? And so it's all, we think, part of the history of the discipline, and that's what we're trying to get at. Laura would probably have things to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we started working on this about 10 years ago, I think there was a sense in literary studies, particularly in the wake of Guillory's Cultural Capital and conversations around that, that there was, Guillory's making an argument essentially about, in the midst of the culture wars, about the contents of reading lists, and, suggesting that merely adding, minority authors onto reading lists in order to make them more representative kind of ignores the larger function of the school itself in the reproduction of homogeneity, of hierarchies. And, that sort of left people with a sense almost that it didn't really matter what they taught, in their classrooms. And that this was, it was easy for people to feel that way because there already wasn't much public conversation beyond the culture wars around common conversation around classroom teaching. And I think there was a tendency to kind of have this all or nothing fantasy about classrooms. Like either classrooms were sort of all powerful and reproductive, or, you could never hope to accomplish anything in your classroom that would extend out into the real world. So I think when it began, we were really just looking for something more of a middle ground of what it actually felt like, that some things failed, some things succeeded. Most things that were happening were not entirely under your control anyways, and to sort of begin to develop a vocabulary around that. I think, in response to your second question about the connection or this kind of maybe break between the teaching of composition and the teaching of literature, you can definitely see the formation of that discipline and the growing split between them and the different labor practices that ensue around the teaching of composition and the teaching of literature. I will say the history of comp, they have done a much better job of historicizing their teaching. They have really excellent disciplinary histories. They have a really good sense of the kind of communal property of their pedagogy. And I think, in literary study, the Miles chapter is a really good example of this. There's just really unrecognized genealogies of literary study that emerge from the teaching of writing and the teaching of composition. And I think given that so many of us do both, always have done both, in terms of just our graduate student TA-ships and then what a lot of people's jobs look like nowadays, we really haven't well accounted, I think, for that continual kind of cross-pollination around those kinds of courses and then these upper division English courses.
If I could step in, I was so moved because, of course, I took English 1A at Berkeley, many years ago. And I have a very vivid memory of reading Lolita in English 1A. Yeah. And I also thought it was incredible the way Miles had them go stand on a street corner in Berkeley, because it's the exact method of the avant-garde French literary movement, the Oulipo. I mean, Georges Perec, who set himself up on the Place Saint-Sulpice to observe the totally banal, for hours and hours. And she sounds like an artist. I mean, it's almost like pre-situationism, what she was having them do. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if she was aware of that, but it's a fantastic exercise in documentary writing that she was doing. Mm-hmm. So that was one comment. And my other comment is about teaching composition versus teaching literature. The equivalent of that in the national literatures, of course, is teaching beginning language versus teaching the great works. And so I think those of us in the national literatures, we all started as teachers teaching elementary grammar, which is even more of a distinction than teaching writing and teaching English literature. And I've always thought that we have very different styles because of that as teachers, because we start out learning that what you do is listen. So it does really change the authority dynamic in the classroom. Just in case you have, these are more like comments than questions for you, but I wonder if it evokes something for all of you.
Yeah, no, that's illuminating, because that hadn't occurred to me, but it's also true that it's kind of almost closer to what Miles is doing, the idea of teaching at the level of grammar and language than assuming that our students already know the structure of the sentence, the structure of a paragraph. It is more like language learning.
Yeah. So, Caleb.
Yeah, that's also true. You would find that in the James Weldon Johnson teaching archive as well, that his introductory course was a language and literature course, although it's in the English department, but has a good deal of grammar and vocabulary built into the literary reading that they're doing.
We've got a couple questions. Here's one. Somebody who values immensely the turn to the everyday practice of the discipline rather than its manifesto statements or public quarrels, but wonders how you make the bridge from the oral place and context specific location of the classroom to the public, published, and circulated domain of written criticism, which has its own overlooked everyday practices of written style.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's really interesting recent work by Jonathan Kramnik on exactly this topic, on how the everyday, the kind of real practical, continuous work of published criticism in literary studies focuses on what he calls inline quotation, just studying the incorporation of the text that you're looking at into your own language.
I think, yeah, I mean, we try to make when we say that we're able to see classrooms kind of present within works of criticism, within major works of criticism, we said that in a kind of brief form here, but we can expand on that a little bit, I think, even with the example of the Eliot. I think one of the things we notice is that the sort of ethos of the classroom, that place-specific, oral, and very communal scene of valuing literature, does get worked up in places like the Sacred Wood, or even in Miles's work on poetry rather than poems, into a kind of vision of literary tradition that is very populist, that is populated by what Eliot calls second-order minds, critics, translators, writers of paratext. And so there is, I think, a sense that when you pivot to the writing of criticism, you're sort of doing it, stepping out of the classroom with more of a sense of how many hands are involved in the creation of a piece of published writing, and in the eventual reception of it, and hopefully the longer trajectories that it makes possible, right, by making other kinds of writing possible. So that was something in stepping for us in moving from this classroom scene to people's published scholarship. We started to pay attention to these ways of thinking about literary tradition, literary value, and the practice of writing that seemed more populist and communal than we'd been led to.
I mean, you completely deconstruct all our mythology about the new criticism. You completely redo our sense of the new criticism. I mean, my generation came up with the sacred mission of fighting the new criticism and all its elitist and close reading only assumptions. So reading about Eliot, and it's quite astonishing. Yeah.
I think that is, I think in critiquing the new criticism and in other things, there has been a tendency to make it more unified, to make it bigger than it in fact was, or more coherent, or more dominant even. So I feel like too, this book kind of comes after a wave of critique that sort of ended up making many things a much bigger deal than they perhaps were in the first instance.
Another question. Oh, sorry, Caleb, did you want to say something before I move to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, I just, I wanted to pick up on Laura's phrase, like what kind of writing it makes possible, because that's sort of how I think about the method wars in a way. Like, it's so obviously wrong that the political economy of our profession is in decline because of too much ideology critique, or the political economy of our profession is in decline because we don't love literature enough or something. Like, it's so obviously wrong that it makes me want to ask the question, well, like, what's being enabled by this mistake? What are people getting from getting it wrong in this way? And I think it is that they get to treat a problem of political economy as if it were the kind of problem that they know how to address in their writing, as if it were an intellectual problem, as if it were a misreading, as if it were a conceptual mistake. And that could be addressed, therefore, through argumentation, through the kinds of skills that they know how to have, and through the kinds of disagreements that we know how to have with each other in public, rather than through a work of a different kind, which would have to do with organizing and the transformation of institutional structures and economic circumstances. And in that way, I mean, I do think that, offering a new history is a little more continuous than totally distinct from that particular move. That is, if we see this different history, a thing we can do is write a history, right? A thing we can do in our role as scholars, specifically in our role as scholars, is write a history and change the history. And maybe that history can, I hope it will, I think it is, changing our understanding of the value of what we do. But it's another step to transforming that political economy, obviously.
Yeah, we talk about this a little bit in our conclusion, but I think part of what this history does is make the work of teaching a more clearly, right, like part of all the work that we're doing in higher education, and not separated from like our work, which is our research that we also like to think of, and which is labor. And so I completely agree with your diagnosis of method wars. Like, we're trying to domesticate them into something we can solve within the English department. And that's just clearly, that's a tragic, tragic mistake. But we do hope in some way that there's work that you can do in the discipline to think about labor in a nuanced and granular way that might help the organizing problem.
It's a blow to alienation and division. It's good. Let me go on with questions. We've now suddenly got a lot of really interesting questions. This one is about teaching online during the pandemic, but also in general on what your work tells you about the growth of online teaching generally versus face-to-face classroom, especially the growth of online teaching in community colleges. And what do you see happening in the classrooms and the courses?
I'm,
Sorry.
no, it's, I mean, yeah, I think, you know, I think many universities were already beginning to go online before the pandemic, particularly in the asynchronous mode. I did training to do that at my university. There was a lot of incentive, financial incentive for professors to move teaching online. And, you know, one thing I noticed in the training is that you're very, you know, they're telling you essentially to leave out anything that remotely resembling kind of scholarly expertise. Like it's like sort of, you have to really like kind of, you know, give people the 3-minute recorded video, no longer than this, and so on. And that, it hasn't been my experience that that's necessarily what students want or are capable of, you know, of receiving. So I do think that we talk a fair bit in just the conclusion to the book about, you know, some of the ways in which in the modern research university, there is a whole industry built up now around telling professors how to teach, right? And giving them advice about teaching.
Yeah, centers for teaching and learning all over, but also visits. Another interesting question on the chat is, what about evaluation of teaching by colleagues in the course of a tenure review or a promotion review? How does that work?
Yeah.
I mean, are we capable of, I'm just imagining an extension of this question, are we capable of evaluating someone's teaching without understanding this larger history and seeing one person's classroom in the context of all these decisions that teachers have made over time?
Right. I like that idea that this can help, that having a deeper sense of the history could help a more professional and contextualized, disciplinarily contextualized evaluation of teaching. It's interesting because when people do look at classrooms, especially the earlier classrooms that we've looked at in scholarly research, they tend to only look at teaching evaluations. So there is this whole kind of interesting history of teaching evaluations being used to stand in for classrooms the way I think they very much are in tenure decisions in which anyone cares at all about them.
It's funny, there's this rumor going on in Europe that Americans are given grades by their students, and they're really appalled by it.
It's sort of true.
Sort of true. Yeah. I've got one, I think we have time for one more question. Did you sense that there's some connection between teaching strategies and research methods, but also literary production? I mean, do some people's way of teaching actually feed right in? It sounds like it's true of Eliot, but other examples of the way that teaching inspires literary production. Now, I take it that means not just critical production, but the production of literary works, maybe fiction or.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably the best example of this in the book is J. Saunders Redding, who is teaching, you know, he's teaching at Hampton in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, courses like Negro and American literature, but also courses on the novel. And he's also writing in a couple of different genres that are, you know, realist. So he's writing a documentary, he's writing a campus novel, and he's sort of writing all around this kind of question of realist representation, you know, as he's teaching in the classroom. So he's teaching Dickens, thinking about how Dickens's autobiography gets written into some of his fiction. at the same time that he's kind of writing all around that matrix as well. So that was a good example of where we really needed to look at the fiction and the literary production in order to understand what he was doing in the classroom.
It's fascinating that you mentioned the campus novel, because it is a genre that's just exploded over the last 30 years. So there is something fascinating about the scene of teaching that appeals to novelists. And all those campus novels are not realist. I mean, some of them are just wild. Surrealist.
I guess the obvious thing there is lecture courses that get basically kind of collated to become books, often kind of introductory books in various fields. But the question about online teaching definitely reminded me that last semester I recorded my lectures as audio lectures, and never has teaching felt more to me like writing than it did then, because it was going to be recorded. I found I can't do these, I can't sort of stand in front of the room and vamp and look at a picture together and interact with the students. And because, they could play it back and so on, I felt almost the level of like writing for publication, like each word has to be precise in its way. And I think there's probably a ton of examples of places where we could find some student question or student response to a lecture, or even the shape of a lecture course that ended up changing that person's book that was based on the lecture course that they gave.
Somebody once told me that when you teach, you just never know what of all the stuff you say is going to stay in the minds of your students. Like don't you remember some just weird anecdote that some teacher told about their dog, and you've forgotten the whole rest of the course, but you remember that one anecdote?
Absolutely.
Yep.
All right,
outcomes.
I'm ending on a little light note here, but I want to thank you all so much for this conversation. It was really, really fun and inspiring. And thank you to all the participants for their questions. We'll go look on the chat too to see your comments now that we're done with the Q&A. So
get this book, y'all, and read it.
And please, we are going to put the link with the University of Chicago Press discount code. We're putting it in the chat.
Thank you so much, Alice. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Alice and Caleb.